Hey guys, what's up? So today I'm going to be reading Peter Pan. So let's start. All children except one grow up. They soon know that they will grow up, and this is how Wendy found out. One day when she was 2 years old, she was playing in the garden, and she plucked a flower and ran to her mother. She must have looked rather delightful, for Mrs. Darling put her hand to her heart and cried, "Oh, why can't you remain like this forever?" Since then, Wendy knew that she would one day grow up. Wendy's mother was a lovely lady with a romantic mind and a sweet, mocking mouth. When Wendy was born, Mr. Darling was frightfully proud, but he sat behind his desk calculating expenses while his wife looked at him imploringly. "I can cut my coffee, say 10 shillings, 8, 9, 7. Dot and carry the 7. And the pound you lent to the man who came to the door. The question is, can we try it for a year on 997? Of course we can, George, cried Mrs. Darling. Then they had 2 more children, first John and then Michael. Mr. Darling had a passion for being exactly like his neighbor. So, of course, they had a nurse, but as they were poor, the nurse was a Newfoundland dog called Nana. The Darlings had become acquainted with her in Kensington Gardens, where Nana spent most of her time peeping into prams. She proved to be quite a treasure. It was a lesson in propriety to see her escorting the children to school, walking nicely by their side and butting them back into the line if they strayed. And she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth in case of any rain. No nursery was run more correctly, and Mr. Darling knew it. Yet he sometimes wondered whether the neighbors talked. He had his position in the city to consider, but Nana also troubled him in another way. He sometimes had a feeling that she did not admire him, and he craved admiration. "I know she admires you tremendously, George," Mrs. Darling would assure him. There never was a happier family until the arrival of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of him when she was tidying up her children's minds. It is the nightly custom of every good mother, when the children are asleep, to rummage in their minds and put things straight for the next morning. Have you ever seen a child's mind? It's called Neverland, and it's an island with astonishing splashes of color and coral reefs. There are savages and lonely lairs, gnomes, caves, and princes, and all is rather confusing, especially as nothing would stand still. Occasionally, Mrs. Darling found things she could not understand, and the most perplexing word was the word Peter. "Wendy, who is Peter?" she asked. "Peter Pan, of course." At first, Mrs. Darling did not know, but after thinking back into her childhood, she remembered a Peter Pan, who was said to be living with the fairies. But he must be grown up by now. "Oh, no, he isn't grown up," Wendy told her. "He is just my size." "Mark my words," said Mr. Darling. "Peter Pan is just some nonsense that Nana has been putting into our children's head. Leave it alone and it'll go away." But it did not go away. One morning, Mrs. Darling found some leaves on the nursery floor. "It must be that Peter again," Wendy said. "What do you mean?" "I'm sure he comes in here during the night, but I've never seen him." "What nonsense!" The window is 3 floors up." "But how else can you explain the leaves, Mother?" Mrs. Darling did not know what to think. On the fateful night when it all began, the children were in bed. All looked so safe and cozy that Mrs. Darling smiled at her fears and sat down by the fire to sew. Then her head nodded and she fell asleep. While she was dreaming, the nursery window blew open and a boy dropped on the floor. A tiny law darted wildly around the room, and Mrs. Darling woke up. She saw a small boy clad in leaves, and somehow she knew that he was Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling screamed. The door opened, and Nana rushed inside, growling at the boy, who leapt lightly through the window. Again, Mrs. Darling screamed, this time in distress, for she thought Peter was killed. She ran down to the street to look for his little body, but it was not there. And when she looked up, a shooting star crossed the night sky. Back in the nursery, Nana was holding something in her mouth. It was the boy's shadow. Mrs. Darling rolled it up and put it away in a drawer, never suspecting that Peter would soon come back on that never-to-be-forgotten Friday. "I ought to have been more careful on that Friday," she used to say afterwards to her husband. No, Mr. Darling would tell her. "I am responsible for it all. If only I had not accepted that invitation to dine at 27. If only I had not poured my medicine into Nana's bowl." They would sit in the empty nursery recalling every smallest detail of that dreadful evening. It all began so uneventfully, with Nana putting on the water for Michael's bath and carrying him on her back. It was then that Mr. Darling rushed into the nursery like a tornado with a crumpled tie in his hand. "This tie will not tie," he yelled. "Let me try, dear," said Mrs. Darling, wearing a beautiful evening gown. At once he forgot his rage and began dancing around the room with Michael on his back. Just then, Nana arrived, carrying the medicine for Michael. "I won't have it," said Michael resolutely. Won't. "Michael," Mr. Darling said with a stern face, "when I was your age, I took my medicine without grumbling." "And you still do, don't you, Father?" Wendy added. "Yes, and I would take it right now if I hadn't lost the bottle." He had not lost the bottle. He had hidden it on top of the wardrobe. "Oh, I know where it is, Father," Wendy cried. "I'll bring it right away." She came back in an instant, carrying the dreadful bottle. Michael first," said Mr. Darling. "Father first," said Michael, who was suspicious. "Why don't you take your medicine at the same time?" cried Wendy. "Certainly. Are you ready, Michael?" Wendy gave the words, 1, 2, 3, and Michael took his medicine, but Mr. Darling slipped his behind his back. "That's not fair, Father," cried the little Michael. It was dreadful to see the look of the disappointment on his son's face. "Look here," Mr. Darling said. "I have just thought of a splendid joke. I shall pour my medicine into Nana's bowl, and she will drink it, thinking it is milk." Children looked at him reproachfully as he poured the medicine into Nana's bowl. "Nana, good dog, I've put a little milk into your bowl." Nana wagged her tail and began lapping it. Then she gave Mr. Darling a sad look and crept into her kennel. Mr. Darling felt terribly ashamed of himself as Wendy rushed to hug the poor dog. "That's right," he shouted. "Hug her. Nobody ever hugs me. Oh dear, no. I am only the breadwinner." "George, not so loud," Mrs. Darling tried to entreat him. "Bring in the whole world, but I refuse to allow that dog to stay in my nursery for a moment longer." The children wept, and Nana ran to him beseechingly. but he waved her back. The proper place for a duck is the yard, and there you go this instant. He seized Nana and dragged her away from the nursery. Tucked in bed, the children could hear Nana barking outside, and John whimpered, "It's because she is unhappy." But Wendy was wiser. That is not Nana's unhappy bark. That's her bark when she smells danger. Mr. Starling quivered and went to the window. It was safely locked. A nameless fear clutched at her heart, made her cry. "Oh, how I wish I weren't going to a party tonight." She went from bed to bed, and little Michael flung his arms around her. No 27 was only a few yards away. Father and Mother Darling were the only persons in the street, and the stars were watching them. Stars are beautiful, and usually they are not friendly to Peter, who has a mischievous way of stealing up behind them, trying to blow them out. However, they like to have fun, and that's the night they won Peter's side. As the door of 27 closed on Mr. and Mrs. Darling, there was a commotion in the sky, and the smallest star screamed out, "Now, Peter!" Okay guys, thank you for watching, and this is the end of the book. And comment below if you want me to read Peter Pan Book 2. Bye guys!